Why did Anakin Skywalker fall? And who is to blame? Or is the better question, who's responsible? And what do we do with that information? On a recent podcast on my Star Wars, on a recent episode of my Star Wars on a recent episode of my Star Wars Generations podcast, we were talking about Revenge of the Sith and this topic of, who is responsible for the fall of Anakin? Is it Anakin? Is it the Jedi? Is it Palpatine? Is it all of them came up? And I realized that we had a fun discussion of it, but it's a much deeper conversation that I wanted to talk to Riki about. And Anakin Skywalker is kind of the chief example, but it's something we talk about a lot in comics and superhero movies is when we get a villain's backstory, when we get their villain origin story, it leads questions of, can we be sympathetic to them? And now who is to blame? Is it their fault that they became a villain? Is it the circumstances they were under? How do we deal with all that? And how do these questions affect the way we see things in our own lives? As always, my co-host for today is Riki Hayashi. Riki, how are we doing today?
This is a very interesting topic, Matthew. So I'm glad you brought it to this podcast as well. Obviously, we're both, you're obviously a fan of Star Wars, but I think some people might not know that I am a huge Star Wars fan as well. I've been a guest on the other. Actually, I think we just released the Bad Batch summary one, right?
You were a guest, but also you and your partner Sarah were co-hosts. I think the longest running co-hosts of the Star Wars podcast for a while.
Yeah, so I Star Wars is very close, near and dear to my heart. And questions like this are on one level very simple, simplistic, but can lead to good discussion.
Agreed. And so let me actually start by saying, when it comes to, as I said, on that other podcast, we did a longer conversation about Anakin. And this isn't as much us discussing who's responsible or to blame for Anakin, as much as it is us talking about how we frame that question. But I'll start by giving you a chance to talk about, why did Anakin fall? And who in your mind is responsible or to blame?
Yeah, the fundamental wordplay here, responsible to me, only one person is responsible, Anakin Skywalker, for his actions.
Right?
Like personal responsibility, I think is very important. But also from a fictional historical perspective, you want to be able to assign blame for incidents like this, the fall of the Republic, right? Like Anakin is responsible for his own actions, killing Jedi and probably other crimes as Darth Vader. But the bigger picture here is the Republic fell, the Jedi Order fell, and who's to blame for that, right? He had a hand in some of that, in the incident in Palpatine's office with Mace, in helping to execute Order 66 by assaulting the Jedi Temple. But it's very rare that one being can solely be, blamed for historically significant events.
Right. That makes sense. I think I look at this through a slightly different lens in that I do think responsibility is important. And I think you're right that Anakin is responsible for the choices he makes. But also, there are a number of other people that make choices that create the situation that Anakin is the person who he is, and he's in that situation when he makes those choices. And I guess this is kind of my central idea with all of this, is that I think blame is a really problematic direction to go, because it really looks for the idea of, if we find one person to blame, that means that everybody else is off the hook. Or we have to say that these two people are equally to blame. Or then it gets into a conversation of, if you say these two are equally to blame, should it actually be more like 70-30 or something like that? And to me, all those conversations are about trying to figure out who did the wrong thing. And when I look at a situation like Anakin's, for me, both within the story, but also outside the story in terms of how we learn from it in our own lives, I think what I come down to is I really want to figure out, like, for each of the different characters and each of the different institutions, what level of responsibility do they have, not for the perspective of blame, but for the perspective of how can they learn to do something better the next time? Does that make sense as a framework?
Sure. I also like another word I would use in this context is accountability.
Yeah.
In that the Republic fell, was replaced by the Emperor or the Empire,
Right.
and then in the future we get the New Republic. And if this were like a real world, if this were real governments, presumably there would be some kind of trials held,
Mm-hmm.
right, to hold people accountable for the Empire, like war crimes trials. And we usually don't get a lot of that in like the fictionalized Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
But if you were to examine it from that perspective, like who do you hold accountable, right? And then
Right.
like you look at Anakin and what he did, and 100% like if they have the death penalty, he's probably getting the death penalty for the things he did. Palpatine, the same thing. The Jedi, like Yoda, I don't like Yoda's obviously not gonna get the death penalty, but you look at how people are held accountable for mistakes in the real world. I mean, like
Yeah.
real world examples like 9/11, Benghazi, like they hold inquiries and in some cases like put people on trial for mistakes that were made that led to bad outcomes.
Right.
And I think there's a very real possibility that Yoda and or the Jedi Council would be held accountable, would be put on trial and held to account for the mistakes that they made that led to the Empire, that led to Palpatine taking over.
Certainly.
Because they cover things up, they lied to the Senate, et cetera, et cetera. Like those are things that they should be held accountable for.
I think that's a really cool way of looking at it with that accountability idea. And I get that you're looking at it through that courtroom punishment thing. And like, even in our own world, you have a teen shooter or some other, a young person or a young adult. Anakin is not, I think he's like 19 or 20, so he might technically be a teenager, but he is a legal adult in this world. But he's still clearly quite young. And yeah, so he might be put on trial for his actions. I think you can certainly say that Palpatine is a groomer, to use that kind of modern parlance. And then in the same way that, like, schools missing all the warning signs about a kid can get sued, I think the same thing could happen here. Because for me, and I guess here's where I'm focusing not even as much on the fall of the Republic, but just specifically the choices Anakin makes. Because what I see is kind of 3 levels of that responsibility. That first level is Anakin himself. He is the person who makes those choices. He's not, he is making those choices himself. He chooses to go against Mace. At some later point, you might want to argue that the dark side is like a mythical, I don't think we know enough about the exact workings of it to know to what extent is he legally responsible, but certainly he chooses to go down that path in his attack on Mace. Then you can say, okay, well, what responsibility does Palpatine have? And I know I often hear this groomer language used a lot. And here's again where I think it becomes very easy for it to become a zero-sum question of people who want to give more blame to Palpatine, therefore want to let Anakin completely off the hook. And to me, that's the wrong. I think Palpatine directly influences Anakin's choices, but Anakin still makes those choices. And then for the Jedi's perspective, I think Anakin is a person who is very vulnerable to Palpatine's manipulation and very likely to make a bad decision. And I think that's a lot of that can be the Jedi should be held accountable in some ways for all the mistakes they make in terms of never giving him a chance to grieve the loss of his mother and repressing all of his emotions and all the things that they do that help make him into the person who makes those choices, And so I kind of see it's these 3 different levels of what brings Anakin to the point that he's at when he makes those decisions.
Yeah, I think we are approaching this from different perspectives. right? Like you're very Anakin focused, and I'm kind of more like system focused.
Right.
So when you talk about like the incident in Palpatine's office with Mace, I would look at that from, I guess, like a legalistic perspective of what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And Mace, in that moment, Mace was about to execute Palpatine, right? Like, I do we agree on that?
Yes.
Like he lifted his lightsaber to strike him down, and that they had like an exchange of like he should stand trial, like no, he's too dangerous. Like I don't remember if Mace says I have to kill him, but he has to be eliminated or something like
Yeah.
that. So he makes his intention clearly. He's going to murder Palpatine, which is not legal, right? Like he's taking an extra judiciary
Right.
action to and making his own declaration, like I'm the judge, jury, executioner in this case. And so I think from like a legalistic, like if this were quote unquote real, from a legalistic standpoint, I don't think what Anakin did was wrong in that moment, right? Like in terms of responsibility or accountability, like I
Mm-hmm.
think what Anakin did was kind of the right thing to do. Now we know because it's fiction that the Palpatine was manipulating the whole situation.
Right.
Like he could have forced lightning and Mace at any point, but he was looking to get Anakin to commit this action to be on his side,
So that's a
right?
very interesting perspective, and I do think you're right that what Mace Windu is doing is, extra legal. He's taking the law into his own hands. And you can argue about whether he's right or not in terms of Palpatine's ability to stand trial, but then this is the problem with vigilante cops and all that kind of a thing. Also, personally, I think Mace is criminally responsible for negligence, for the ridiculous, I'm going to pull my lightsaber all the way back and give Anakin 30 seconds to decide if he wants to cut my hand off or not. I think, though, the idea that Anakin is acting properly would only make sense if he then he stops Mace from killing Palpatine, but then he also like tries to use his lightsaber to stop Palpatine from killing Mace. Because he doesn't he leaves Mace incredibly vulnerable to Palpatine, and then when Palpatine kills Mace, he does nothing. And to me, that's where it is clear to me, at least, that Anakin's concern there is not that what Mace is doing is illegal or wrong. It's that he needs Palpatine alive for his own selfish purposes of keeping Padme alive. And so it's harder for me to and that he's perfectly fine with Palpatine killing Mace. And so it's harder for me. And then in his mind, that leads to the what have I done? Like he, I think, certainly sees it, not that he did the right thing, but that he in that act has irrevocably chosen Palpatine and the Sith and the dark side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think I agree in general. Like the main thing is like he disarms Mace, literally, right? Like he cuts his hand off, but his action is meant to incapacitate Mace's ability to kill Palpatine. Palpatine's ability to kill Mace was unexpected for both Mace and for Anakin. Like shooting the Force lightning and sending him flying out the window was not. I don't think anyone really, including the audience, like really expected that to happen in that moment. So I don't know.
I mean, he'd been Force lightning him before. I thought that I was 100% not surprised.
Oh no, you're right.
Well, either way, though, I think we're getting a little bit too locked into that legalism of that one particular moment. I guess for me, what I'm and even if we don't talk about the decision with Mace, is also, then he goes and attacks the temple and all that, and then he starts on this dark path and does all these terrible things. And I think we can have a larger conversation about who's responsible for the fall of the Republic, and maybe let's do that next. I guess what I'm just getting at is I feel like when the conversation is that because we can put a lot of, I like this idea of accountability instead of either blame or responsibility on both the Jedi and Palpatine, that somehow lets Anakin off the hook. And to me, that's where this idea of everyone is responsible for their own actions. And I at least think, especially when it comes to our own world, that it's important to be able to hold this tension, that we can both say people make their own choices and are responsible for those choices. but also a lot of other people made choices that put people in that position, and that the point, like, when we look at young men who, commit horribly violent crimes, teen shooters and stuff, but also just people born in bad circumstances and the like, we can often look at the circumstances they come from and decisions that were made. Or when we were talking about this on the Star Wars podcast, Erin was talking about how she listens to true crime all the time. And almost all the people they talk about were horribly abused as children and then turn out to be these horrible people as adults. But of course, lots and lots and lots of other people are treated badly as children and do not turn out to do that. And so the idea being kind of that, I think, to me, that we can hold this tension of saying, if the Jedi had been a lot smarter in how they had helped raise Anakin, I think it is almost impossible, very unlikely, that Anakin makes the choices that he does. But still, it is, at the end of the day, like, Anakin is the person who makes those choices, and he is responsible for those choices. But the person he is largely formed by the Jedi and by Palpatine and others, and so accountability can go to everyone.
So again, like, Anakin is responsible for his own actions. I think what you're getting at is that there are kind of like divergent points where we can see if someone other than Anakin had done something differently, we can imagine a different outcome. Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Well, like, I'll give you one example. I think if Obi-Wan had been more open to... We have a lot of evidence in the texts, particularly in some of the books that came later, but even the movies, that Anakin had some suspicion about... Obi-Wan had some suspicion about Anakin and Padme, but never actually talked to him about it. As well as the idea that by this time, Anakin certainly feels like that the Jedi would not allow his relationship with Padme. In a situation that is not so, strict and repressive, or at least where Obi-Wan has talked to him, in a world where Anakin doesn't feel like he has to keep his relationship with Padme a secret, he's much more likely to talk to some of those people and talk about the dreams he's having, so that Palpatine isn't the only one who he's listening to. Like, it's been a while, but I studied a lot about how groomers work and things like that. And one of the things that really gets talked about a lot is that groomers often are able to focus on kids who feel like they are outsiders, often because they're not being listened to at home or at school, or they're not having, other places in their life where they feel like people respect them and are, treating them well. And so when someone starts saying, "Oh no, I think you're actually great. No one, it's so sad that no one listens to you," they become very responsible to that potentially manipulative groomer person. And to me, that's exactly what I see with Anakin. Like, I don't think he's anywhere near as responsive to Palpatine if the Jedi treat him better.
Okay. But I guess where we're going is, like, what are you holding the Jedi responsible for?
Well, I guess that's what I mean is, I think it's a great question, because this is kind of where we have to find new language, I think. And we're using Anakin as an example. I think there's other people we can talk about as well. Kingpin, I think, is another great one, but also any hero where we're given enough of their sympathetic backstory that we have to sort of ask about it. I think that if the Jedi are putting people like him and like Barriss, or like even General, Pong Krell, that's a terrible example, but if the Jedi are putting people like Anakin or even Barriss into situations like this, it's not a question of to what extent are they legally responsible. Can they be sued? Can any of them go to jail? To me, I would want the Jedi after Anakin, or however they're being rebuilt by Luke, to be able to say, we failed Anakin. Anakin made his own choices, but in part that's because we failed him. How can we do better? That to me is the really important question, is because I think if you just say, oh, Anakin was his own man, he made his own choices, or it was all Palpatine, that means the Jedi don't have to do any work on themselves. And I guess that's what I'm really coming to, is I want everyone involved to be saying, yes, other people are responsible too, but what did we do wrong and how could we fix it for next time?
Yeah, and the interesting, like, one perspective I might give on that is don't let Anakin be a Jedi.
Yeah,
As
I think
as
I think
weird as weird as we like think of the he's too old thing with Anakin, and maybe like the Jedi were indoctrinating kids at a very young age. The fact of the matter is, like, based on their established order and their
mhm.
rules and all that, he shouldn't have been a Jedi, right? Like,
Yeah, I think it's
part
fair.
part of the problem here is that he broke the mold, and that's why to some degree they didn't know what to do with him.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
even up to the point where he's falling in love with Padme and is hiding it and is not sure what to do, he himself could have made the decision to leave the Jedi Order at that point and just marry
mhm.
Padme.
Yeah. And imagine if Obi-Wan had been willing to sit down with him and say, "Hey, look what happened with me and the Duchess, Satine. I know that I could have chosen not to. I could have chosen to give up the order for her, and I, in some level, did. And of course, the terrible thing happened, and Maul killed her. And just sat down with him and said, "Hey, this is a choice you should make," but acknowledged it as something that he could have done or thought about. This is a
Mm-hmm.
weird analogy, I realize, but one of the things I think about a lot is that a lot of groomers, especially when it's more sexual in nature, really thrive in situations of very, very restrictive sex ed, where kids are not being told anything about their bodies. Kids are not being, they're just told abstinence first, abstinence first. All those desires are sinful and wrong. You should just ignore them. And so they start looking elsewhere. They go on the internet and start talking to people in chat rooms who may be, older predatory people, or and I'm painting this horrible picture. Again, a lot of times people just find information they need. But, a kid who's being given healthy, age appropriate sex ed material, yeah, I mean, all kids are probably not all, but a lot of kids are probably just going to go look online for porn or whatever. But that person's not as they're not as needing, some outside person to answer the questions that no one else will answer for them. And it's not exactly the same with Anakin, but it feels kind of similar to me that he had all of these feelings about Padme and he had no one to talk to about it. And I think you make a really good point about the no one knows what to do with it, because to me, there's a direct link to his feelings about Padme and not knowing what to do with it, and his feelings about his mother. And Obi-Wan can, kind of, I don't think he meant it to be cruel, but when Obi-Wan just sort of says, Anakin, you need to let go of your attachment to your mother. You need to just live in the moment. It feels like someone who hasn't had a parent, hasn't lost a parent saying to someone, "Oh, just get over it." Obi-Wan never had an attachment like that as a kid that he had to let go of when he was 9 years old. And so Obi-Wan, he's not able to relate to Anakin, and he's not able to understand why it's so hard for Anakin to let go of this.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I'm trying to organize my thoughts.
Go for it.
The Obi-Wan thing. Yes. So I don't know. I lost my thought.
Well,
Sorry.
I'll just say there's a huge irony here in that on the Star Wars podcast, I was one of the ones being like, no, we've got to talk about Anakin being responsible, because one of my co-hosts there describes himself as an Anakin apologist, and I was very much on the like, no, this is, to me, we're still very much on it is Anakin's fault. He makes the choices he makes. It's not just Palpatine. He's making a lot of bad choices throughout the Clone Wars, getting insanely jealous over Padme's, former flirtation, killing people, like, killing all the Tuskens. Like, none of this is in any way to defend Anakin. It's just to say that, I guess here's maybe another way to say it. When Anakin chooses the dark side, I think we have to, to me, the better question is not who's to blame. It's why does he choose the dark side?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he is the one making the choice. It's his responsibility. But lots of other people don't make that choice. Luke doesn't make that choice. And I think we could just say, well, that's just because Luke is a better person than Anakin, and Anakin's just a bad person. But to me, that's a really dangerous road to go down, because then all of us can say, oh, we're just better than Anakin. We don't have to confront the fact that we might have made that same choice too under different circumstances. So for me, it becomes really important to ask, what are the factors that helped make Anakin into the person that would make that choice?
Yeah. And what I would say is that someone can be a victim of circumstances and
Mm-hmm.
a an object of sympathy, a tragic figure, as I think we might portray Anakin Skywalker.
Mm-hmm.
But that same person, it is also the perpetrator of more harm, right?
Right.
And I don't think it needs to be a one or the other. Like
Yeah, exactly.
one leads to the other. And we can be sympathetic to the character Anakin Skywalker and say it sucks that his mom died. It sucks that, he had these dreams about his wife dying, and all of that. Those are the stepping stones that lead to his fall to the dark side. But he's the one that falls, right? Like he
Yep.
is the one who commits the atrocities, and nothing in his circumstances should excuse his crimes. They explain them, I think, is the best way to put
Yeah.
it. Um, and so, like, being an Anakin apologist, like, I think that is as much a part of a consequence of discourse, right? If
Mm-hmm.
the discourse of fandom is like, Anakin's a villain, he's to blame, like he's the worst. Yeah, you can have a conversation where like these are the circumstances that led him to become this monster,
Right.
and I think that makes for more compelling narratives as well. So it's good to explore that.
I've got a lot of responses there, and we're going to get right into that right after this. We're starting the conversation, but we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts, questions, or anything else you want to hear us discuss to feedback@theethicalpanda.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok under The Ethical Panda. You can even chat with us on Discord or Facebook. Find those links in the show notes or on our website, theethicalpanda.com. And if you like this content, why not become a member? You get early access to ad-free episodes for all podcasts in the Ethical Panda family, along with bonus content at the end of most episodes, plus member-only episodes. And it's just $5 a month, or $55 for a full year. Sign up at theethicalpanda.com or through the link in the show notes. And now, back to our episode. Welcome back, everyone. I want to keep talking about this, and there's a lot to say about Anakin, but I wondered if we could broaden it out to a couple of other characters to throw into the mix. And I want to start, Riki, with a show that you and I both love and have talked about a lot, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Because let's look at the characters of Zuko and Azula. Zuko and Azula are both the children of Fire Lord Ozai. Fire Lord Ozai is, incredibly abusive, both physically and emotionally. He pushes his kids to terrible directions, and a lot of the terrible things that they both do are, in large part, I think you can directly trace them to the kind of upbringing they have. Now, Zuko gets exposed to some really good people, especially Uncle Iroh, but also just the Avatar gang themselves, and winds up kind of having his villain turn, but then his hero turn in a way Azula never really does.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you place blame for the two of them? Or again, I bring up this whole conversation of blame, responsibility, or accountability, and especially they're like literal teenagers, not, at least kind of past the age of majority. Not that it's that significant, but legally it is. Where would you kind of put the two of them in this conversation?
I think I would apply the same kind of framework in that they're responsible for their own actions, even though they are teenagers. Like in a lot of these fictionalized worlds, teenagers do a lot of things that are larger than life, whether it's on the good side or the bad side. So we kind of have to accept that that's a thing, and perhaps, like being tried as a minor might not be as much of a thing in a world where
if the military gives you command authority, then you're kind of treated like that.
It's problematic, like for framing.
Mm-hmm.
But in this world, like, yeah, both Zuko and Azula, as teenagers, are given command of some number of troops and do
Right.
things in the war to, perpetrate violence against other states and people. So I think they are accountable for those actions
Mm-hmm.
as individuals.
Right. Can we also though look and say that the circumstances in which they were raised had quite a lot to do with them becoming the people who made those choices?
Yeah, and I think, like, if they were held to, some kind of trial, that would probably come into it because they are
Right.
so young and
Mm-hmm.
put in these situations. I do think it's reasonable, like, under the circumstances, to say, yeah, there are definitely mitigating circumstances of their upbringing, and especially, like, the way that they are thrust into these military positions.
Right. Well, and to me, one of the most interesting questions about them is now we're not just talking about the villain turn that they both take, but the hero turn that one of them takes. And we only have the story as it's written to us, and Zuko is much more of a point of view character, whereas Azula is really just kind of the presented as villainous. Although I think we're supposed to also feel some sympathy for her, to be sure. Do you think that if Azula had spent a year with Uncle Iroh, that she might have made any of the kind of hero turns that Zuko did, or is there just something fundamentally different about? Because on the one hand, like I feel like Zuko gets that very different moral influence. On the other hand, when they're both children at the Emperor's palace, like Azula is still like fairly sadistic and maybe responsible for the banishment or death of their mother, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that okay, that's never addressed, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the show, the original show, I think Zuko says, like, he's gonna go find his mother or something like that, and I think there are some comic books, but
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, like, Azula seems to have had a hand in that
Yep.
disappearance. In terms of Iroh, like, it's hard. You can't just, like, cut and paste and replace, like,
Mm-hmm.
Zuko with Azula and say, like, well, what would have happened, because they're
Right.
they're different people on different paths. And part of the thing with Azula is she shows that ambition early on, which gets the attention of Ozai, and why he chooses to focus more of his attention on her at a younger age
Mm-hmm.
compared to Zuko. Not just the ambition, but also her abilities as a firebender. So it it's like, it's very difficult to just say, like, oh, well, what if Azula had the influence of Iroh? Like, she
Right.
didn't, because she was already a different person, and the two adults in the situation, Ozai and Iroh, basically, like, took each of the kids under their wing because they saw something in them that reminded them of themselves, or whatever, however we want to frame that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point there, and it's hard because there's a part of me that wants to be very careful about saying like, oh, you can just tell when children are 6 years old who's going to be a good one and who's going to be a bad one. And when I see Azula at 8 or 10 or however old she was, um, you know, having that naked ambition and that sadism in a lot of ways, especially in how she tortures, or I should say teases and torments, but clearly with a very cruel streak to it, not a loving, gentle teasing of both her brother and her friends. Kids don't just turn out like that. That has a lot to do with parenting. That has a lot to do with the situations that they're raised in, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So it it kind of goes to a longer story, a larger point that I've been thinking about a lot that I think relates to this, which is that I think when we think about which villains deserve our sympathy, I think there's a danger of sort of falling into this trap of if the authors or the creators show us a character's backstory, And therefore we can be like, oh, this is why they turned out this way. Okay, they're still the villain. I still want the hero to defeat them, but I'm sympathetic to them. Whereas when they don't show a backstory, we just assume, okay, that just means it's just because they're a terrible person. And I think that can be a very effective thing. I think, perhaps one of my favorite, if not my favorite, comic book movie, The Dark Knight, the second in the Christopher Nolan series, they very intentionally don't give Heath Ledger's Joker an origin story. He actually kind of makes up different origin stories, and clearly none of them are true, or at least their parts all true or whatever. And to me, that's really effective because that really shows, like, no, this is not sympathetic evil. This is just someone who has a completely different moral framework that is completely immoral from anything we understand. But I think there can be a tendency to, if we see the backstory, we have the sympathy, and when we don't, we don't. And I kind of feel like if we had seen moments with Azula before she becomes the person that we see her on screen, when Ozai starts to, kind of take her under his wing, we might feel very differently towards her.
Yeah, I like learning is constant. Like growth as people is constant. Like we're talking about these kids, but even as adults, there are moments where something can be reinforced, right? Like good behavior can be reinforced, bad behavior punished, and like we use that framework to decide, like going forward in the future, do I want to continue doing good things, or do I want to continue doing bad things? And bad things is like, it doesn't have to be necessarily like high crimes. Mm-hmm. I think I would say like speeding, right? Like speeding on the highway, going above the speed limit is technically against the law, but we all do it. Mm-hmm. And we do it because when we go over the speed limit, there are no consequences. We don't, if you stick within a certain range, you're not going to get pulled over, and you're hopefully you're not going to cause an accident, mostly because we're all doing it and doing the same thing. But that's like a very minor example of like a reinforcement. Like, oh, I'm just going to go 5 miles over the speed limit. Right. Everything's fine, so I'm going to continue to do that. And
what I think I would say is that there is a speed limit that most of us observe, but it's 5 to 10 miles over what is printed.
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's kind of like driving society has kind of evolved past more archaic speed limits, and some places like have upped the speed limit due to those changes. Some places haven't. And then, of course, like there's always instances where you might get pulled over because a certain area decides to enforce the posted limit more strictly, right? And then you kind of like, if you know that or you discover that, you're like, okay, well now in this section of highway near this town, I know I have to go slower.
Right.
And we adjust our behavior. And that's again, like the consequences of that are not earth-shattering. Like we're not talking about life or death. Well, hopefully life or death situations. But I like to think of that as like, yeah, like we always make decisions, and some are quote unquote good and some are quote unquote bad, but it doesn't, I don't think it necessarily casts us as good or bad people, like in the big picture when we make certain decisions. But like we should think about them. Like we should think about our decisions, why we do them. Like I actually, because I'm a jogger and I like jog on city streets, like when I'm driving in city areas, I tend to go a little slower because I'm very conscious of that, of like being aware of joggers, bikers, pedestrians, and just like the responsibility I have. Because when I'm jogging, like some people, I'll tell you, just like aren't paying attention and will like cut me off at intersections and stuff, and I'll just like be standing there like that was very dangerous. Like you didn't even look for me. So I try, because of my background as a jogger, and
Yeah, no, I like what you're talking about there. And I think that kind of speaks to this whole idea of that you can both take personal accountability while also recognizing that there's other factors there. Um, I'm going to get very kind of real for a second here, but this is something I've talked about before. I had a lot of abuse in my childhood and a lot of really problematic situations, and have wrestled with a lot of mental health demons because of that. I've been in a great situation for the last couple of years, but especially when I was younger, I was not a great person and made some decisions that really hurt a lot of people. And I can look to the abuse, I can look to the things that happened to me when I was a kid, the trauma, and trace a direct line towards, being the person who was desperately concerned that people would leave me alone, and so wound up, without even realizing, kind of being manipulative to people around me, or all these kind of things. And I say without even meaning to, because on some level it's true, but I'm not saying that to excuse myself at all. It's just more that these become unconscious behaviors. And I always had the option to kind of do more self-examination, and I didn't. And that's it. It is my responsibility. I took the actions. The person who I was, who made those actions, was very formed by a lot of problematic things that happened in my childhood. And I think that's the thing, is I think we're kind of in this, we're really agreeing, is that we need to be able to have that double space of saying, unless you are like, at gunpoint, or, you're being coerced, or like, there are lots of things that can take away a person's ability to make choices. And then we can talk about that. But when, a person is making a choice, but they're making a choice in part because, of whatever else they're dealing with, yeah, we can still, we can say you were accountable for those choices, but also, because again, to me, the point shouldn't be, oh, if you're mad at me for making the choice, no, go be mad at my father, or go be mad at my school system. It's more, yeah, be mad at me. I made the choices. I hurt people. But also, I would hope that, if I were ever a parent, I'd want to be able to look at that and be like, what were the choices my father made? How can I break that? And what were the choices his father made, and then his father made? And how can I break that cycle? What were the choices that my schooling made in terms of, what it tolerated in terms of bullying? And how could I try to find a school that was different than that, or things like that? It's at the end of the day, I'm not interested in who to blame. I'm interested in who can change their behavior to prevent these situations happening in the future.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And I think that's why the Jedi, I'm use the word blame again, get blamed so much for what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, even though we are saying that Anakin Skywalker is responsible for his own actions, the Jedi Council, I mean, I said it earlier, they literally lied to the Senate.
Yep.
Right? And I would say conspired. Again, from like a legal standpoint, I think there was a criminal conspiracy to hide I think the Jedi they said they were losing their connection with the Force, and hence they were unable to detect the Sith, right? I think was the conversation that happened. And so, like, they know that there's a Sith Lord somewhere in the galaxy. And I think they even begin to suspect that they are somewhere like within the halls of power. Right. And they're unable to do anything about it. And they don't tell anyone that they can't. And they don't ask for help, right? So that, to me, that is the failing of the Jedi. Like, less so Anakin Skywalker and like teaching him and all that, but it's just like their whole shtick of like, well, what if we just kind of like bumble around and don't tell anyone?
And I'll certainly say the High Republic books establish that this does not start with the prequels, that as far back as 250 years ago, most of the people in the Clone Wars are not born for another century, but Yoda was certainly around. And there were other issues that came up that would have really shaken the Republic and the Senate's understanding of the Jedi, and even some of the Jedi themselves, in terms of this challenge they faced. And Yoda explicitly decides to keep that a secret and to erase it from the Jedi archives, and to not only not tell the Republic or the Senate, but not tell anyone else in the Jedi. And I think that it's very intentionally they like a lot of institutions do, this is exactly the problem with Catholic Church or governments that will say, well, we know we made a mistake, but we need people to trust us, so we can't admit our mistakes publicly, because then people will see us in a bad light or something like that, and they're able to convince themselves they're doing the right thing for the greater cause, but of course it's not.
Yeah, and I suspect or hope, I don't know, We are going to get more of that story in live action with the Acolyte show, right?
Yeah.
That takes place approximately 100 years before Phantom Menace.
Mm-hmm.
That there's going to be some kind of, oh no, it's the Sith. Like, well, we better cover it up.
Yeah. I think that may well happen. We'll see. We'll see. One other character I want to throw out, something else that people mentioned in the Facebook post I put up about this, the character of Killmonger. In the movie Black Panther, you have T'Challa and I think his first name is Eric. I forget, but the person known as Killmonger. And they are both princes of Wakanda, but they have these incredible different upbringings and wind up going to incredibly different places. How much of that do you think is the different circumstances they had versus just being different people?
Oh, we're going nature versus nurture.
I mean, that's kind of what a lot of this is about, right?
Yeah. I mean, the way it's presented, I think a lot of it is, which word do I want? A lot of it is nurture.
Right.
Um, because Killmonger is presented as a person who grew up in the United States, Oakland, I believe,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And saw the racial inequity in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And then once he came to be aware of the existence of Wakanda and their power, basically asked, like, why are you letting this happen out
Right.
here? And so without that experience, without his upbringing in the United States, like, he probably doesn't have those feelings.
Right. Well, certainly T'Challa has the exact opposite. And he has a fairly, you could say, a really wonderful upbringing. I might also say a very entitled upbringing. But either way, it's that
Privileged, right?
privileged.
Like,
Yeah, I think
Wakandan privilege.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, he's not driven by that anger, but also that he doesn't have that same need to go out and fix these things until they're pointed out to him in that same way.
Yeah, T'Challa doesn't see them. Probably,
Yeah.
he's never experienced that.
Right. And there again, that's one of those situations where Killmonger's father is killed in part to cover up, and that these stories are never told and things like that.
So. And I believe in the first movie, Nakia, right, like, tries to tell him some of the stuff that's going on, and she's kind of like that moderate position of trying to convince him before Killmonger comes along.
Yep. So, all right. Well, this has been a great conversation, Riki. Thank you so much. Any other last comments you want to make or points you want to bring up?
Yes, I want to ask Disney, Star Wars to give me the show I want now of, like, post Imperial fall war crimes tribunals.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we need that in Star Wars, but we are getting some interesting storylines in, like, the Mando era of ex-Imperials still in power within the New Republic.
And under Mando, we're getting the idea that there are some war crimes trials happening, but also a lot of people being forgiven if they will be kind of like good Republic citizens. Which, I think that, to me, I watched that one episode and I was like, why don't you give me a whole show about this? This looks phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, and I kind of joked, but I think to some degree they need to do more with that idea to explain the First Order.
Yes.
Right? Because when the postquel movies came out, a lot of us were like, how did this happen? Like, how did the First Order just kind of like flip a switch and take over again? And they are starting to fill those gaps, and I think a lot of those gaps have to be that the new Republic was not as good as we would like to think it was.
Yeah. Well, I think it faced a very difficult question, which is, and throughout history, like democracies that are established in the wake of a recent overthrow of authoritarianism have a very bad success rate. Like, they often will fall back into authoritarianism again, particularly if time isn't spent setting up democratic institutions and social institutions that can help carry it. A lot of the nations of Africa are great examples of this, where the English and French and Belgians, in many cases quite intentionally, were just like, okay, you don't want to be in our empire anymore. We're just gone. We're not going to do anything to help you transition. And a lot of the places there were elections held, and then those governments were seen as illegitimate. And then fairly quickly, authoritarians took over, often with either CIA or KGB support. And so to me, this question of the New Republic, of where it's like, yeah, what does it do? Because on the one hand, it wants to be super democratic. It wants to be not authoritarian. But then with their problems on the Outer Rim happening, how do you not be authoritarian, but also not, impose, if you don't impose law and order, does that mean the Hutts and everyone else just takes over? And how do you find that balance? It's a topic that's starting to get explored in some books. The book, what's it called? Bloodline is one I think you would really, really like. I think actually we talked about it before.
No, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The Leia one.
Yep. But yeah, I would love to see that more explored further. The last thing I'll just say about this is, do you know much about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
I do not.
So it is a model that I want us to follow more in the real world, but I also think would really be applicable in a place like this, because and I think it's one of the most brilliant things Nelson Mandela ever did, which is he said, look, we need to really know the truth of all the terrible things that happened under apartheid and all the things that individual people did and that collectively happened. But that if we're ever to heal as a society, this can't be about now the black people are in power, and so we're going to punish all the white people for all that they did to us. We need to heal and move forward. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was all about exactly that. It was about learning the truth, finding ways to have reconciliation without it being about punishing or like criminalizing the actions that happened under apartheid. And in some ways, that's what I think there are people who are like, wait a minute, people who are, doing horrible things under apartheid got off the hook, and that's not fair. And I think there's some legitimacy to that. But overall, I think it's looked at as a much more successful way of getting past a terrible situation like what happened there than in a lot of other places where they never really be able to get past, okay, well, we're in power now and we're still angry at you for what you did for 50 years and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's the kind of thing that I feel like if that had happened, that might have helped prevent the First Order. And that's a story. I would love to now have another conversation about who's responsible for the First Order. And is it just Palpatine and Snoke and Kylo Ren? Is it Leia and Luke? Is it Luke for going off and doing his own thing? Is it the people in the New Republic?
It's Mon Mothma.
Yeah,
I hate to say it because I love her so much as a character, and especially like what's going on with her character in Andor is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But at least the way the books that we've read, like what they seem to be establishing is that Mon Mothma didn't have a plan or did not execute the plan well, like post fall of the Empire, and disbanded the military too quickly and too suddenly, and just thought that things would return to old Republic standards.
Yeah.
When it's difficult to do that, like as you just said, like the first generation after the fall of an authoritarian regime, I think it's very important to establish like ground rules and to shut out some of those old members from power.
Yeah.
Like, I've talked in the past about how post-imperial Japan, like the first prime minister after the U.S. occupation, was actually someone who was part of the old regime and was even charged with war crimes, convicted of war crimes, like minor, as minor as war crimes can be, but they're convicted of minor war crimes and then became prime minister of post-war Japan. Right. And that, Japan as a country is peaceful, but there are still like these tendencies, especially like in government, that unfortunately, like I could see a return to like not necessarily empire, but definitely like an authoritarian militaristic country.
Yeah. Well, and certainly we're seeing that in a lot of parts of Europe right now. Eastern Europe, especially, but also fascist parties in the rise in Germany and here in the United States. So, yeah. On that cheery note, thank you so much, listeners, for being a part of this. You're fantastic as always. Riki and I love having you be a part of this. As I said at the beginning, please think about becoming a member. You're going to get bonus content. Riki and I are about to talk about the Acolyte for just a few moments, our hopes and fears about that. You get member-free member bonus episodes, and most importantly, you're helping to keep this going, keep the lights on, and all those other good things. So please become a member. Send in your feedback. Let us know what you think. We love getting all your thoughts. On behalf of myself and Riki, thank you so much for being a part of this. We have spoken. Superhero Ethics is an Ethical Panda podcast, part of the True Story FM network. If you enjoyed the show, please share it and leave a rating or review in your podcast app if possible. The best way to support us is by becoming a member. Find info and social links in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Welcome back, members. Thank you so much, as always. So, Riki, without going into too many spoilers, I don't know if you've seen trailers, not seen trailers. I have not. But just in terms of the general conversations going on around about it, how are you feeling about the Acolyte? What are you excited about? What are you fearful for? What are you hoping for?
My general feeling is indifference, because I, as a Star Wars fan, like I never really connected with like High Republic storylines. I was always more interested in the Imperial era, and then I guess the New Republic era. So I have like very little knowledge or background and understanding of the history of the High Republic and I guess the Jedi during that period. I'll watch it because it's Star Wars and I love Star Wars, but I don't really have like very high expectations or any excitement for it the same way I did about, say, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, because that was like the sweet spot for me. And then of course, like Andor was just like mind-blowingly good, like in general, and it made me a huge fan. So I'm gonna watch it. I hope it's good, but I just like have no expectations or any like I needed to do this, I need to do that. Like I speculated about the cover up of the Sith thing because that's just kind of like historically that's what has to happen. Like the Sith can't really do anything in this era. But we don't even know necessarily if it's Sith or not, like because that's a very specific thing. Like it could be other dark side things happening.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I'm somewhat the opposite in that I am very excited about this time period. I've really been loving the High Republic. And I just think as much as I love the Skywalker story, as much as that's been a central part of my life literally since I was born, I'm really excited to see Star Wars stories in which Skywalker is just not a word that's ever said, in which we are long before that. And especially as, I think one of the questions you and I come back to all the time is what are the Jedi really like and why are they like that? And is that good or is that bad? And more as we've gotten to the place of, well, actually, maybe the prequels are not the best representation of what the Jedi were always like. I'm really excited to see more of like, okay, well, let's see what the Jedi were like at a different point in time.
Yeah. I chuckled when you said like you're excited for no Skywalkers. Just because like I have some expectation that they might mention Jedi prophecies to some degree, right? To set all that up. And I don't know if Skywalker is a name that's in any of the prophecies. Like they can just make up new prophecies, but they may have like some line about like he who walks the skies or something like that, just to be like cheeky about it.
I'd roll my eyes a little bit, but I'd be fine with something like that. It's more just I just want new characters. I want new storylines.
Yeah. Like the cast. Like, are you okay talking about some of the cast?
Yeah, no, I know. Especially because I know there's the very prominent Japanese actor in it whose name I forget. But
is there? I'm looking at the cast right now. Who are you talking about? I don't see anyone. Like the one I know about is Carrie-Anne Moss.
Right.
The Trinity from the Matrix series. And she's phenomenal. I don't see anyone. I see a prominent Korean actor, Lee Jung Jae. I think he was in Squid Games. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, this may be my making that mistake, and I apologize then.
And I
Yeah.
haven't watched Squid Game. Obviously, like
Mhm.
it was very popular, and my
Right.
understanding is that he's a very good actor or a great
Mhm.
actor, even. So, yeah, like the two of them, I know, recognize. And then Manny Jacinto is in this cast. If you've seen The Good Place,
Mhm.
he plays what was his name in that? Jason. He plays like the
Oh yeah,
airheaded
the
guy.
Florida guy.
Yeah, Bortles.
Yeah.
um,
I,
Pretty sure he's not going to be playing the same type of character, so it will be good to see him, break out of that mold.
I mean, yeah, I'm having my first thought is that it's going to be some kind of scoundrel type, but heart of gold, complete idiot, heart of gold, head of rock, just really dumb, really lovable. I'm trying to imagine him as a wise Jedi, and I'm sure the actor can pull it off, but it's going to be very weird to me.
No, that'll be good. Hopefully, that'll be good for his career, right?
That's
To
very
not
good typecast.
get typecast into that type of role.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think we're on the same page. I think there's a lot I'm excited about. It looks like a fantastic cast. It looks like some really great characters. I think kind of picking up on what you said, those who know me well know that my biggest fear is always that we're going to do things that, the more and more you add things to the backstory that don't get mentioned, the more my eyebrows go up, and like you said,
Mhm.
like, I feel like if there's one character who knows that the Sith may be back and that character decides to stay silent or that character winds up getting killed, I'm totally fine with that. If like
Mhm.
Yoda and the entire Jedi Council find out that the Sith are back and they all just, then I'm sort of like, oh boy. Or if it's like,
But
this huge war that they wind up fighting in the show that never got mentioned 100 years later, then I'm also like, come on, guys, this sort of stretches credulity.
but don't you
So,
think that would be consistent? Maybe not like a huge war, but just like a pair of Sith. Because the rule of two. Let's say a pair of Sith are the villains on the show, and they try to do Sith things, and then the Jedi stop them, and
mm-hmm,
there's like a discussion with Yoda and some other Jedi on the council, and they say like, what should we tell the Senate? And they're
right.
just like, nothing. This never happened.
Yeah.
You don't think that that's consistent with what we understand of the Jedi
I think it's,
by Phantom Menace?
I think it certainly could be. I think if it's phrased as we all know that they are Sith, but we're going to lie about it, I would want something more nuanced. Like there's one person in the council saying, Master Yoda, I think these were Sith. And the rest of the council, and maybe including Yoda, are like, no, 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 the Sith died out 1,000 years ago. These were dark side users. We don't need to tell the Senate because the Senate's just going to think they're Sith, but we know it's not Sith. That kind of like half ignorance, half sweeping it under the rug, half being happy to be ignorant.
Hmm. Okay.
I just want nuance. I want complexity.
I
So
guess I want consistency.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that would still be consistent. I think it's just that they just don't have to have quite as much information.
Yeah.
So we'll see. All right, Riki, as always, thank you so much to our listeners, our members, especially right now. Thank you all so much. We have spoken.